The Hebrew Bible's epic journey moves from the stories of Genesis to the dramatic saga of Exodus. The descendants of Jacob, once welcomed in Egypt thanks to Joseph, multiply into a nation so numerous they alarm a new Pharaoh. Fear turns hospitality into oppression, and the Israelites are forced into brutal slavery. Yet this suffering sets the stage for a story of liberation and faith that will shape history. Joseph's rise in Egypt, through his gift of dream interpretation, saves his family from famine and plants the seeds for the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt. Over centuries, this small family becomes a nation, setting the stage for the Exodus. The Exodus is a foundational myth. Miracles, plagues, and liberation from slavery. But did it really happen? The scale described in the Bible is staggering, yet Egyptian records are silent. Egypt's meticulous scribes left no mention of Hebrew slaves' plagues or a mass escape. Some see this as evidence the story is myth, but history is often written by the victors. Could the Exodus be a memory of a real event, transformed by centuries of storytelling? Our search for truth leads us to the Hyksos expulsion, a possible historical echo of the biblical tale. Joseph, Jacob's favoured son, dreams of greatness, visions that spark his brother's jealousy. His dreams foretell a future where he will rise above his family, fueling resentment and fear. The brothers see Joseph as a threat, and their envy drives them to betrayal. Joseph's dreams set in motion a chain of events that will change the fate of the Israelites. The stage is set for a dramatic act of treachery in the fields of Dothan. Joseph's journey from dreamer to exile begins, fulfilling the very visions that doomed him. Joseph's brothers seize their chance, selling him into slavery and deceiving their father with a bloodied coat. Jacob is devastated, believing his beloved son is dead. Joseph is sold in Egypt to Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard. From favored son to slave, Joseph's fortunes seem lost. Yet his story is far from over. Divine providence will guide him even in bondage. The dreamer's journey has only just begun. In Potiphar's house, Joseph's talents shine, but a false accusation lands him in prison. There, his gift for interpreting dreams brings him before Pharaoh, who is troubled by ominous visions. Joseph predicts 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and proposes a plan to save Egypt. Impressed, Pharaoh elevates Joseph to Vizier, second only to himself. Joseph's rise from slave to ruler is complete, setting the stage for his family's arrival in Egypt. The fate of the Israelites and the story of Exodus now hangs in the balance. Centuries passed. The memory of Joseph, the Hebrew vizier who had saved Egypt from famine, faded into the mists of time. His family, the descendants of Jacob, had flourished in the fertile delta land of Goshen, fulfilling the biblical promise to Abraham that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars. They had grown from a small clan of 70 souls into a vast and populous nation within a nation, but their very success became the source of their downfall. The book of Exodus tells us that a new king arose over Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. This new Pharaoh looked upon the burgeoning Israelite population not with gratitude for past services, but with suspicion and fear. He saw their numbers as a potential threat to his power and the stability of his kingdom. This fear, born of xenophobia and political paranoia, began to poison the Egyptian consciousness. The Pharaoh voiced his concerns to his people, speculating that in the event of a war, this large foreign population might side with Egypt's enemies, turning against the very nation that had sheltered them. The solution was as brutal as it was simple: to crush the Israelite spirit and halt their growth through forced labor. The era of sanctuary was over. The age of oppression had begun. The Pharaoh and his court devised a plan to transform the Israelites from honored residents into a subjugated slave class, stripping them of their freedom and turning their strength into a tool for the Egyptian state. It was a calculated policy of systemic oppression designed to break them. The biblical text states, therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. The Israelites were conscripted into massive labor gangs, forced to toil under the unforgiving Egyptian sun. Their lives became a bitter cycle of relentless, back-breaking work. They were commanded to build massive supply cities for the Pharaoh, named in the text as Pithom and Ramses. These projects were immense undertakings, requiring the molding and firing of millions of mud bricks, the quarrying and hauling of stone, and all manner of hard labor in the fields. Every day was a struggle for survival under the whips of the Egyptian overseers, a harsh reality far removed from the pastoral life their ancestors had once known. Yet despite the crushing weight of their servitude, the Israelites endured. The narrative emphasizes a divine paradox, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. This resilience only intensified the Pharaoh's fear and frustration. His initial plan to control the Israelite population through hard labor had failed. It had, in fact, backfired. The people's spirit, though tested, was not broken, and their numbers continued to swell. The Pharaoh's dread deepened, compelling him to escalate his campaign of oppression. He realized that mere enslavement was not enough to contain this perceived threat. A more sinister, more final solution would be required to secure his throne and the future of his empire. With his initial strategy of control through forced labor proving ineffective, the Pharaoh's fear metastasized into a policy of outright genocide. He decided to attack the Israelites at their most vulnerable point, the moment of birth. His new plan was chilling in its cruelty and precision. He would sever the future of the Hebrew people by eliminating its next generation of men. The Pharaoh summoned the two chief Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to his court. He gave them a direct and terrifying order, a royal command that violated every tenet of their profession and their humanity. He was turning healers into executioners, instruments of life into agents of death. The decree was laid out in no uncertain terms. The Bible recounts his command: when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. This was a secret war waged in the birthing rooms, a clandestine effort to systematically erase the male lineage of the Israelites. The Pharaoh believed that by destroying the men, he would not only curb the population growth, but also eliminate any potential for future rebellion or military alliance with his enemies. It was a calculated, cold-blooded strategy aimed at the very heart of the Hebrew family and the continuation of their people. However, the midwives, in an extraordinary act of civil disobedience, defied the most powerful man on earth. The text states they feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. Their faith in a higher authority gave them the courage to subvert the royal decree. When a furious Pharaoh confronted them, demanding to know why the Hebrew boys were still living, they offered a clever excuse. They claimed that the Hebrew women were so vigorous that they gave birth before the midwives could even arrive. This quiet, courageous rebellion by two women represents the first recorded instance of resistance against the oppressive Egyptian regime. Thwarted once again, the Pharaoh's genocidal campaign became public and all-encompassing. He was no longer willing to rely on covert methods. He issued a brutal edict to all his people, transforming every Egyptian citizen into a potential executioner of Hebrew infants. The command was simple and horrific. Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. The Nile River, the source of Egypt's life and prosperity, was to become a mass grave for the children of Israel. A shadow of terror fell over the land of Goshen as the hunt for newborn boys began. A desperate time when the cry of a baby could mean a death sentence. Amidst this state-sanctioned slaughter, one woman from the tribe of Levi, a woman named Jochebed, gave birth to a son. The Bible describes the child as a beautiful child, and seeing this, his mother refused to surrender him to the Pharaoh's decree. For 3 months she managed to hide him, her every moment filled with the terror of discovery. The slightest sound, the faintest cry, could betray their secret and condemn her baby to a watery grave. But as the infant grew, concealing him became impossible. With a heavy heart she knew she could no longer keep him safe within the walls of her home. She had to entrust his fate to the river, but not to its deadly currents. In a desperate act of faith and ingenuity, Jochebed wove a small basket out of papyrus reeds, meticulously sealing it with asphalt and pitch to make it waterproof. She was not abandoning her child to the river, she was building him an ark. Placing her precious son inside this tiny vessel, she set it afloat among the thick reeds along the bank of the Nile, the very place where the royal household often came to bathe. She instructed her daughter Miriam to watch from a distance to see what would become of her brother. This single act of a mother's love and defiance would set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of history for both Egypt and the Israelites. As divine providence would have it, the Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the Nile to bathe. She spotted the strange basket hidden in the reeds and sent her maidservant to retrieve it. Upon opening the small ark, she found the baby boy, and he was crying. The princess was immediately moved with compassion. "This is one of the Hebrews' children," she said, fully aware of her father's cruel edict. At that moment, Miriam, who had been watching intently, bravely approached the princess. She cleverly offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for her. The princess agreed, and Miriam ran to fetch her own mother, Jochebed. Thus, in a stunning turn of events, the child's own mother was hired to nurse and care for him, her wages paid by the very royal house that had ordered his death. When the boy was old enough, Jochebed brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who formally adopted him as her own son. She named him Moses, explaining, "Because I drew him out of the water." Raised in the opulent splendor of the Egyptian palace, Moses grew up as a prince of Egypt, educated in all the wisdom and knowledge of that great civilization. He was a Hebrew by birth, yet an Egyptian by upbringing, a man caught between two worlds, destined to one day lead his true people out of the very house that had raised him. Years passed as Moses lived the quiet life of a shepherd in the land of Midian. He had traded the silks of an Egyptian prince for the simple garments of a desert nomad, his past life a distant memory. The man who had been raised in the corridors of power now wandered the desolate landscapes, learning the ways of the wilderness and the rhythms of a life far from the courts of Pharaoh. One day, while tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, his path led him to the foot of a formidable mountain, a place known as Horeb, the mountain of God. It was here, in this remote and sacred place, that his ordinary life was about to be interrupted by an extraordinary divine encounter that would redefine his existence and set him on a new, terrifying path. As he led his sheep across the arid terrain, a strange and wondrous sight caught his eye. A lone bush on the mountainside was engulfed in flames, yet it was not consumed. The fire burned with an intense, otherworldly light, but the leaves and branches remained green and whole, untouched by the heat. Curiosity drew Moses closer to this impossible spectacle. He had to understand the nature of this phenomenon, why this particular bush was not turning to ash. As he approached, a voice called out to him from the heart of the fire, a voice that knew his name. "Moses, Moses," it boomed, and he replied, "Here I am." He was standing on holy ground in the presence of something far beyond his comprehension. The voice identified itself as the God of his fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. At this revelation, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. The voice then spoke of a covenant remembered, of a promise that had not been forgotten. "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt," the voice declared, "and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." God had witnessed the suffering of the Israelites and had now come down to deliver them from their bondage. The plan was not just for liberation, but for a great journey to a new home, a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Then came the command, the charge that would shatter Moses' peaceful existence. "Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Moses, the fugitive shepherd, was overwhelmed with self-doubt and fear. Who was he to confront the mighty Pharaoh, the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth? He argued with God, protesting his inadequacy, his lack of eloquence, his unworthiness for such a monumental task. But God was insistent, promising to be with him, to give him the words to say and the signs to perform. His quiet life was over. He was now to be the reluctant prophet, the chosen instrument of divine liberation. Armed with a divine mandate and accompanied by his brother Aaron, Moses journeyed back to the land of his birth and his exile. He returned to Egypt, a place fraught with memories of both privilege and peril, to stand before the new Pharaoh. Their initial request was deceptively modest. They did not immediately demand total freedom. Instead, they asked that the ruler of Egypt allow the Israelite people to go on a 3-day journey into the desert to hold a religious festival and worship their God, Yahweh. It was a test, a first step to gauge the Pharaoh's heart and his willingness to acknowledge a power higher than his own. The Pharaoh's response was one of arrogant dismissal and utter contempt. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go?" he scoffed. "I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." In his worldview, he was a god on earth, the ultimate authority. The idea that he should heed the command of an unknown desert deity of a slave people was preposterous. Instead of granting their request, the Pharaoh punished the Israelites for their audacity. He ordered his taskmasters to intensify their labor, commanding that they no longer be supplied with straw for making bricks. They would now have to gather their own straw while still meeting the same daily quota of bricks, an impossible and cruel task. Leaving the palace, Moses and Aaron were confronted by the desperate Israelite foreman, who blamed them for making their situation even worse. Their hopes of a simple religious observance had been dashed, and their suffering had only increased. With a heavy heart, Moses returned to God, questioning the mission. But God reassured him, promising that now he would see what divine power could truly accomplish. Moses and Aaron went before Pharaoh a second time, this time to issue a direct demand for the release of their people. The Pharaoh, unimpressed, demanded a sign, a miracle to prove the authority of their God, essentially challenging them to a contest of power. This led to the first supernatural confrontation in the Egyptian court. As commanded by God, Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it miraculously transformed into a serpent. This was a powerful symbol, but the Pharaoh was not easily swayed. He summoned his own wise men and sorcerers, the elite magicians of Egypt, who, through their secret arts, duplicated the feat. They cast down their own staffs, which also became serpents. For a moment it seemed to be a stalemate, a draw between the power of Yahweh and the magic of Egypt. But then Aaron's serpent staff asserted its dominance, lunging forward and devouring the serpents of the magicians, a clear omen of what was to come. Despite the dramatic display of the dueling serpents, the Bible tells us that Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go. The initial miracle had failed to break his resolve. A more severe and widespread demonstration of power was now required. God instructed Moses to meet Pharaoh by the Nile River the next morning and deliver an ultimatum. Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, would now strike the very heart of Egypt, its lifeblood, the Nile itself. With the same staff that had become a serpent, Aaron struck the water, and in an instant the entire river and all the water throughout Egypt turned to blood. The fish died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink from their primary water source. This first plague was a direct assault on the Egyptian pantheon, targeting Hapi, the god of the Nile. Yet the Pharaoh remained defiant. His own magicians were able to replicate the plague on a smaller scale, turning water into blood with their own enchantments. This small success was enough for Pharaoh to harden his heart further, viewing the plague as a powerful but ultimately replicable trick. So a second plague was unleashed. Hordes of frogs swarmed out of the contaminated river, covering the land and infesting every home, from the palace of Pharaoh to the ovens of the common people. The sheer overwhelming presence of the creatures forced Pharaoh to bargain, promising to let the Israelites worship if Moses would only remove the frogs. But once they were gone, he reneged on his word. The pattern of plague, negotiation, and reneging was established. The third plague, a swarm of gnats or lice that rose from the dust, could not be replicated by the Egyptian magicians. This is the finger of God, they admitted to Pharaoh, but he would not listen. This was followed by the fourth plague, swarms of flies that tormented the Egyptians but miraculously avoided the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived, a clear sign of divine precision. The fifth plague struck down the livestock of Egypt, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep, while the animals of the Israelites remained untouched. Yet with each successive blow, Pharaoh's stubbornness only seemed to increase, his heart growing harder and more resistant. The plagues grew in severity and became more personal. The sixth plague brought agonizing boils that afflicted the skin of every Egyptian, including the magicians themselves, who could not even stand before Moses. The seventh was a terrifying storm of hail and fire that rained down from the sky, destroying crops and killing anyone caught outside, yet sparing Goshen. The eighth plague brought a devouring swarm of locusts that consumed whatever the hail had left, leaving the land barren. The ninth plague was a profound supernatural darkness that covered all of Egypt for 3 days, a darkness so thick it could be felt, isolating every Egyptian in their own home, while light shined in the dwellings of the Israelites. Still, Pharaoh refused to yield, setting the stage for one final devastating plague. After 9 devastating plagues had assailed Egypt, crippling its economy, terrifying its people, and challenging its gods, the heart of Pharaoh remained stubbornly encased in pride. He had witnessed his mighty river turn to blood, his land overrun with frogs, lice and flies, his livestock perish, his people afflicted with boils, his crops destroyed by hail and locusts, and his kingdom plunged into an impenetrable darkness. Yet, with each display of divine power, his resolve only seemed to solidify. Now, Yahweh announced through Moses that one final terrible judgment would be brought upon the land, a blow so catastrophic and personal that it would finally shatter Egypt's defiance and compel the release of his people. This 10th and final plague was to be the most horrific of all, the death of the firstborn. God declared that at midnight he would pass through Egypt, and every firstborn son from the heir of Pharaoh sitting on his golden throne to the firstborn of the captive languishing in the dungeon would die. Even the firstborn of the livestock would not be spared. This was not a random act of destruction, but a targeted strike against the future of Egypt. A measure-for-measure judgment for Pharaoh's decree to kill the Hebrew baby boys. The coming night would be one of unprecedented sorrow, and a great cry of anguish would rise from every Egyptian household, for there would not be a house without one dead. To protect the Israelites from this sweeping devastation, God instituted a new ritual, a sacred observance that would become the cornerstone of Jewish faith and memory, the Passover. Each Hebrew family was commanded to take a perfect, unblemished lamb and slaughter it at twilight. They were then to take a hyssop branch, dip it in the lamb's blood, and smear it on the two doorposts and the lintel of their homes. This blood would be a sign, a symbol of faith and obedience. When the angel of death passed through the land, he would see the blood and pass over that house, sparing the firstborn within. It was a covenant of protection sealed in blood, a powerful demarcation between the chosen and the condemned. That night the Israelites were to roast the lamb and eat it in haste, dressed and ready for a journey, with their sandals on their feet and their staffs in their hands. They were to eat it with unleavened bread, as there would be no time for dough to rise, and bitter herbs to remember the bitterness of their slavery. As the final instructions were given and the meal was prepared, a heavy silence fell over Goshen, a silence of anticipation and fear. The fate of two nations hung in the balance, awaiting the stroke of midnight. This night would mark the end of 400 years of bondage and the violent, traumatic birth of a new free nation. Precisely at midnight, the final dreadful prophecy came to pass. A silent, unstoppable force moved through the land of Egypt, and the promised destruction was unleashed. The Bible vividly describes the scene. The Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. The night was shattered by a collective wail of unimaginable grief. In every Egyptian home, from the most opulent palace to the humblest dwelling, a cherished son was found dead. The heir to the empire, Pharaoh's own child, was taken, breaking the line of succession and striking the ruler not just as a king, but as a father. The national catastrophe finally broke the will of the defiant Pharaoh. His pride, his power, and his heart were shattered by the personal loss and the overwhelming scale of the tragedy. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night, his voice no longer filled with arrogance but with panicked desperation. "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel," he commanded. "And go, serve the Lord as you have said." He not only granted them leave, but urged them to go immediately, even asking for a blessing as they departed. The Egyptian people, frantic with fear and grief, also pressured the Israelites to leave, showering them with silver, gold, and clothing, desperate to be rid of them lest they all be dead. Thus began the Exodus. A vast multitude of people, which the Bible numbers at 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, poured out of their homes in Ramses. They moved as one body, a nation suddenly set free after centuries of servitude. They carried their unleavened dough on their shoulders, a testament to the haste of their departure. This was not a planned, orderly migration. It was a desperate flight, a chaotic scramble for freedom under the cover of darkness, leaving behind the only home they had ever known for an unknown future in a wilderness guided only by a divine promise. The years of bitter slavery were over, and the long journey to the promised land had begun to guide them on their path through the vast and featureless desert. God provided a miraculous and constant escort. They did not need maps or mortal guides, for their path was marked by a divine presence. By day, a towering pillar of cloud moved before them, leading them along the correct route and providing shade from the relentless desert sun. By night, the cloud transformed into a pillar of fire, illuminating their way and offering warmth and protection in the cold darkness. This continuous, visible manifestation of God's presence was a constant reassurance that they were not alone, that the same power that had delivered them from Egypt was now leading them toward their destiny. And in the immediate aftermath of the 10th plague, the Egyptians were just consumed by grief and fear, eager to see the Israelites depart. However, once the initial shock subsided and the funeral rites were concluded, a different emotion began to take hold in the heart of the Pharaoh. The economic reality of losing his entire slave labor force began to sink in. The great building projects would halt, the fields would lie untended, and the very foundation of Egypt's prosperity, built on the backs of Hebrew slaves, would crumble. The stinging wound of his son's death festered into a burning rage and a deep, resentful regret. He had let his workforce, his property, simply walk away. This regret quickly turned to resolve. Pharaoh's hardened heart, it seemed, was not completely broken, but merely cracked. He summoned his commanders and declared, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" The decision was made to recapture the fleeing slaves. He mustered the full might of his military power, his elite chariot corps, the most advanced and feared mobile fighting force in the ancient world. The Bible specifies that he took 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, each manned by skilled warriors and drivers. An entire army was mobilized to chase down the disorganized and vulnerable column of former slaves. Meanwhile, the Israelites, led by the pillar of cloud and fire, had made their way to the edge of the sea. They encamped by the water beside a place named Pi-Hahirot, with the sea before them and the desert wilderness hemming them in on all sides. They believed they were safe, finally free from the reach of their former masters. The sight of the endless water before them was a symbol of their new beginning. But, their sense of security was about to be violently shattered. The thundering sound of approaching horses and the glint of sun on bronze armor appeared on the horizon. The Egyptian army had caught up to them, trapping them against the sea. The sight of Pharaoh's approaching army struck terror into the hearts of the Israelites. Panic and despair swept through the camp like a contagion. Their newfound freedom seemed horrifically short-lived. They turned on Moses, their voices filled with bitter accusation and fear. Because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness?" they cried. "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness." All hope seemed lost. They were an unarmed crowd of men, women, and children caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, the most powerful army in the world behind them, and an impassable body of water before them. Facing the rebellion of his terrified people and the imminent onslaught of the Egyptian army, Moses stood as a bastion of faith. He raised his voice above the cries of panic, urging the Israelites to be calm. "Do not be afraid," he declared. "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." As he spoke, the pillar of cloud, which had been leading the Israelites, moved behind them, positioning itself as a barrier between the camp of Israel and the army of Egypt. For the Egyptians it cast a deep darkness and confusion, halting their advance, while for the Israelites it continued to provide light. Then, under God's command, Moses stretched his hand out over the sea. This was not an instantaneous, cinematic parting of the waters as often depicted. The biblical text is very specific, stating that the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night. For hours a powerful supernatural wind blew upon the waters, pushing them back and transforming the seabed into dry land. A path emerged through the heart of the sea, a corridor of safety with the waters piled up like a wall on their right hand and on their left. It was a miracle born of divine power working through a natural force, a testament to the night-long struggles to carve a path to freedom. With the path now open, the children of Israel began their perilous journey into the midst of the sea, walking on dry ground. The entire nation, with their families and their livestock, moved between the towering walls of water, a sight both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Seeing their prey escaping, the emboldened Egyptians, shrouded in the darkness from the pillar of cloud, pursued them into the seabed passage. The entire Egyptian army, all of Pharaoh's horses, his 600 elite chariots, and his horsemen, charged into the corridor, confident that they could easily overtake the fleeing slaves and drag them back to Egypt in chains. They plunged headlong into the trap that divine providence had laid for them. As the morning watch approached and the last of the Israelites reached the far shore, the Lord looked down upon the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw them into a state of chaos. The wheels of their chariots became clogged with mud or were supernaturally removed, causing them to drive with great difficulty. Panic erupted among the Egyptian soldiers as they realized they were fighting not just against slaves, but against a powerful, unseen deity. "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians," they cried. But it was too late. God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand once more, and the walls of water collapsed, returning the sea to its full strength, swallowing the entire Egyptian army. Not a single soldier, not one chariot remained. The threat was eliminated, and the Israelites were truly free. Having witnessed the utter destruction of the Egyptian army, the Israelites celebrated their miraculous deliverance with songs of praise on the far shores of the sea. Their freedom, bought at such a dramatic price, was finally real. But the euphoria of their newfound liberty was short-lived, as the harsh realities of their new environment quickly set in. Led by Moses, they journeyed from the sea into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert of Shur. For 3 days they marched under the scorching sun, their water supplies dwindling with every step. The landscape was a monotonous panorama of sand and rock, offering no relief. The elation of their escape began to curdle into anxiety as a new, more insidious enemy emerged: thirst. After 3 days without finding a source of water, they finally came to an oasis, a place named Marah. Their relief, however, turned to despair when they tasted the water, for it was bitter and undrinkable. The people, their throats parched and their spirits low, began to grumble against Moses. Their memory of divine salvation was already fading, replaced by the immediate and pressing misery of their present circumstances. "What shall we drink?" they cried out, their faith wavering at the first sign of hardship. The miracle at the sea seemed a distant memory, and the wilderness ahead loomed as a place not of promise but of death. Their first test of faith in freedom had arrived, and they were failing. In desperation, Moses cried out to the Lord, who then showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw the wood into the bitter water, and miraculously the water became sweet and potable. It was here, at the waters of Marah, that God made a statute and an ordinance for them, testing their obedience. He promised that if they would diligently listen to his voice and do what was right, keeping his commandments, he would protect them from the diseases he had brought upon the Egyptians. From Marah, they journeyed to an oasis called Elim, a place of 12 springs and 70 palm trees. A temporary paradise that offered a brief respite from their arduous journey. But soon they moved on, entering the desolate wilderness of Sin, which lay between Elim and the great mountain of Sinai. A month and a half had passed since their departure from Egypt, and the food they had brought with them had run out. Hunger now replaced thirst as their primary torment. Once again, the entire congregation murmured against Moses and Aaron, their nostalgia for Egypt becoming a bitter refrain. "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt," they lamented, "when we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." They romanticized their slavery, remembering the full bellies but forgetting the sting of the lash. The journey through the wilderness was, a relentless cycle of hardship and divine intervention, a continuous test of the Israelites' fragile faith. After leaving the wilderness of Sin, they traveled from place to place according to the Lord's command, guided by the pillars of cloud and fire. Eventually, they set up their sprawling camp in a desolate, rocky place called Rephidim. But here there was no water at all for the people to drink. The brief comfort of the Elim oasis was now just a distant memory, and the immediate desperate need for water once again pushed the people to the very brink. Their grumbling, which had become a constant undercurrent of their journey, suddenly erupted into open contentions with their leader. The people confronted Moses, their fear and frustration boiling over into aggressive demands. "Give us water to drink," they insisted, their tone honestly bordering on mutiny. Moses, weary from their constant complaints, tried to reason with them, replying, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But his words, well, they just fell on deaf ears. The people were consumed by a collective thirst that eclipsed their reason and their reverence. They even accused Moses of malicious deception, arguing that he had led them out of Egypt with the express purpose of killing them, their children and their livestock in the middle of the empty, sun-scorched nothingness. The situation grew increasingly volatile. The crowd was on the verge of stoning him, their desperation twisting into a kind of murderous rage. Fearing for his life and the complete collapse of his authority, Moses cried out to Yahweh for help. He laid the people's complaint and their violent threats before God, asking what he should do. The Lord responded with a command for another public miracle, one that would not only provide for the people's physical needs but also serve as a powerful reaffirmation of his presence among them. The divine solution would once again demonstrate that their survival depended not on the landscape but on the power of their God. God instructed Moses to take some of the elders of Israel as witnesses and to go on ahead of the people to a specific rock at Horeb. He was to take in his hand the same staff with which he had struck the Nile. The Lord promised, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." Moses did as he was commanded. In front of the elders he struck the great stone, and a torrent of fresh, clean water began to flow from the solid rock. He named the place Massa, meaning testing, and Meribah, meaning quarreling because of the Israelites' strife, and because they had tested the Lord, asking, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Just as the Israelites solved the crisis of thirst at Rephidim, a new threat appeared on the horizon, this one human. The Amalekites, a fierce nomadic tribe of the desert, launched a surprise attack on the traveling nation. They were opportunists, preying on the weak and vulnerable, striking at the rear of the long Israelite column where the weary, the sick, and the stragglers were located. This was actually the first military conflict the newly freed people had to face. They were not a trained army, but a collection of families, really unprepared for organized warfare. The survival of the nation now depended not just on miracles of provision, but on their ability to fight for their lives against a ruthless enemy. Moses quickly devised a two-pronged strategy. He commanded his trusted lieutenant Joshua to choose men and go out to fight the Amalekites on the battlefield the next day. This was a crucial delegation of military authority, a sign of Joshua's rising prominence as a leader. While Joshua would lead the physical battle in the valley below, Moses would ascend to the top of a nearby hill to engage in a spiritual battle. He would stand with the sacred staff of God in his hand, overseeing the conflict from above. The fate of the battle would be determined not only by the swords of the men below, but by the intercession of their prophet above. A strange and powerful phenomenon occurred as the battle raged. As long as Moses held up his hand, holding the staff of God aloft, the Israelite forces prevailed against the Amalekites. But whenever he grew weary and lowered his hands, the tide of the battle would turn, and the Amalekites would gain the upper hand. Seeing this, Moses' companions, his brother Aaron and another leader named Hur, devised a plan. They had Moses sit on a stone, and they stood on either side of him, holding his arms up. They kept his hands steady until the sun set, ensuring the symbol of God's power remained raised over the battlefield until the very end. Because of this sustained intercession, Joshua and his men were able to achieve a decisive victory, overwhelming the Amalekite forces and securing the safety of the people. Following this event, Moses received a visit from his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, who had heard of all the great things God had done for Israel. Jethro, seeing Moses overwhelmed by the burden of judging every dispute among the people from morning until evening, offered some wise counsel. He advised Moses to delegate authority, to appoint trustworthy men as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, to judge the small matters, bringing only the most difficult cases to Moses. This practical advice established a system of governance that would be essential for the nation's future. 3 months to the day after their departure from Egypt, the Israelites arrived at the foot of a towering, imposing mountain that rose dramatically from the desert floor. This was Mount Sinai, the very place where Moses had first encountered God in the burning bush. Here in the shadow of this sacred peak, the entire nation set up camp, their long journey bringing them to a place of divine appointment. The wandering was, at least for the moment, over. This was to be the site of the most significant and formative event in their history. They were no longer just a multitude of escaped slaves. They were about to be forged into a holy nation, bound by a sacred covenant with their deliverer, Yahweh. God called to Moses from the mountain, instructing him to ascend. On the slopes of Sinai, God laid out the terms of his proposed covenant. He reminded Moses of how he had borne the Israelites on eagle's wings and brought them to himself, delivering them from the mighty Egyptians. Now he offered them a special status among all the peoples of the earth. Now therefore, God declared, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It was a profound offer of a unique relationship, conditional upon their obedience. Moses descended the mountain and presented these terms to the elders and the people of Israel. Their response was unanimous and immediate. Having witnessed God's immense power in their deliverance and provision, they readily agreed to the conditions. All that the Lord has spoken we will do, they declared in unison. With their acceptance, the stage was set for the formal ratification of the covenant. God instructed Moses to have the people consecrate themselves for 2 days, washing their clothes and preparing for a direct, though terrifying, encounter with the divine. He warned them to set a boundary around the mountain, for anyone who even touched it would be put to death. On the morning of the 3rd day, the divine presence descended upon Mount Sinai in a spectacular and terrifying display of power. The air was filled with peals of thunder and flashes of lightning. A thick, dark cloud enveloped the peak of the mountain, and the piercingly loud blast of a shofar, a ram's horn, echoed through the encampment, causing all the people to tremble in fear. The entire mountain was covered in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire, and it quaked violently. It was from within this awesome tempest of fire and smoke that God spoke the words that would become the moral foundation for Western civilization, the 10 Commandments. While Moses remained on the cloud-shrouded peak of Mount Sinai, enveloped in the divine presence, the people below grew restless. Days stretched into weeks, and their leader, the sole intermediary between them and the terrifying God who had spoken from the fire, did not return. His prolonged absence created a vacuum of leadership and, well, a crisis of faith. The people, accustomed to the tangible, visible deities of Egypt, struggled with the concept of an unseen God. Fear and impatience began to fester, eroding the solemn vow they had so recently made. They approached Aaron, their voices demanding a more familiar form of worship, one they could see and touch. Overwhelmed by the pressure of the anxious crowd, Aaron relented. He instructed the people to bring him their golden earrings, the very treasures they had received from the Egyptians upon their departure. From this collection of gold he fashioned a molten calf, an idol reminiscent of the bull cults of Egypt, such as the worship of Apis. When the people saw the gleaming statue, they proclaimed, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." Aaron then built an altar before the calf and declared a feast to the Lord for the following day. They had quickly broken the first and second commandments, turning from their invisible deliverer to a lifeless object of their own creation. Up on the mountain, God perceived the people's betrayal, his anger burning against what he called a stiff-necked people. He informed Moses of their swift corruption and declared his intention to destroy them completely and start a new nation from Moses alone. In a powerful moment of intercession, Moses pleaded with God on behalf of the Israelites. He reminded God of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and argued that the Egyptians would mock him, saying he had only brought his people into the wilderness to kill them. Moses' passionate appeal succeeded in turning away God's wrath, but a punishment was still necessary for their grave sin. Descending from the mountain with the 2 stone tablets containing the 10 commandments, Moses witnessed the scene of idolatrous revelry firsthand. His own anger blazed. He threw the tablets to the ground, shattering them at the foot of the mountain, a dramatic symbol of the people's breaking of the covenant. He then seized the golden calf, burned it in the fire, ground it into a fine powder, scattered it on the water, and forced the Israelites to drink it. To purge the evil from the camp, he called upon those who were still loyal to God. The tribe of Levi rallied to his side, and on his command they went through the camp and executed about 3,000 of the idolaters. This brutal act, followed by a plague sent by the Lord, violently re-established order and solidified the new covenant. After the terrible events surrounding the golden calf and the renewal of the covenant, the Israelites continued their journey towards the promised land. They eventually arrived at a large, well-watered oasis known as Kadesh Barnea on the southern border of Canaan. From this staging point, Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout out the land that God had promised them. For 40 days, the spies traveled through Canaan, assessing its fertility, its cities, and the strength of its inhabitants. They returned with a massive cluster of grapes, a testament to the land's incredible bounty, confirming that it was indeed a land flowing with milk and honey as God had promised. However, the report from the spies was, deeply divided. While all agreed on the richness of the land, 10 of the spies brought back a terrifying account of the people who lived there. They described fortified cities so large their walls reached to the sky, and inhabitants who were giants, descendants of the fearsome Anakim. We were like grasshoppers in our own sight, they reported, and so we were in their sight. This discouraging report spread like wildfire through the camp, extinguishing all hope and replacing it with terror. Only 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, offered a dissenting opinion, urging the people to trust in God's power to deliver the land into their hands. The fearful report of the 10 spies plunged the entire nation into despair and open rebellion. They wept throughout the night, once again lamenting that they had ever left Egypt. They refused to trust in God's promise and even plotted to select a new leader to take them back to a life of slavery. Their lack of faith was a direct rejection of God's power, which they had witnessed firsthand at the sea and in the wilderness. They stood on the very cusp of realizing their dream, but their fear was greater than their faith. This collective failure of nerve at the threshold of the promised land would have devastating and long-lasting consequences for an entire generation. As a result of this rebellion, God issued a divine judgment. The 10 faithless spies were struck down by a plague, and a harsh sentence was passed on the people. The entire generation of Israelites who had come out of Egypt, all those aged 20 and older who had grumbled against him, would not be allowed to enter the promised land. They were condemned to wander in the desolate Sinai wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each of the 40 days the spies had scouted the land. Their children, the very ones they feared would perish in Canaan, would be the ones to inherit the promise. Only Joshua and Caleb, the two faithful spies, would be spared to enter the new land. The long, arduous journey through the wilderness was about to begin in earnest. The 40 years of wandering came to an end. The generation that had known slavery in Egypt and had rebelled at Kadesh Barnea had passed away in the wilderness. A new generation, raised in the desert under the law of the covenant, now stood poised on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan River, ready to finally enter the land promised to their forefathers. Moses, now an old man of 120 years, had faithfully led his people through every trial and tribulation. He had been their prophet, their lawgiver, their judge, and their military commander, but he too would not be permitted to cross the river and set foot in the promised land due to an earlier act of disobedience at the waters of Meribah. From the plains of Moab, Moses ascended Mount Nebo to a high point called Pisgah, which overlooked the Jordan Valley and the sprawling landscape of Canaan. From this vantage point, God granted him a panoramic vision of the land his people were about to inherit. He saw the territories of Gilead and Dan, the lands of Naphtali, Ephraim and Manasseh, and the land of Judah stretching to the distant Mediterranean Sea. He saw the southern Negev and the lush plain of Jericho, the city of palm trees. God spoke to him one last time, reaffirming the ancient promise. "This is the land of which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants." This final vision was a bittersweet gift. God concluded his words to Moses by saying, "I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." The great prophet who had brought the people out of bondage and guided them for 4 decades would only see their destination from afar. His journey was at its end. The Bible then states with simple finality, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord." His death marked the end of an era, the closing of the foundational chapter in the history of the Israelite nation. The manner of his burial is shrouded in mystery, adding to his legendary status. The text says that God himself buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his grave to this day. This detail prevented his tomb from ever becoming a shrine, ensuring that the people's worship would remain focused on the invisible God, not on the memory of the man. Despite his advanced age, Moses' vitality had not diminished. For 30 days the children of Israel wept for him, mourning the loss of the leader who had spoken to God face to face. With his death, the mantle of leadership passed to his faithful lieutenant Joshua, who would finally lead the people across the Jordan and into their destiny. The epic narrative of the Exodus, as chronicled in the sacred books of the Torah, presents a story of such monumental scale and divine intervention that it strains the boundaries of historical verification. When we examine the biblical account with a critical eye, certain elements immediately stand out as challenging from a logistical and archaeological perspective. The sheer numbers cited in the text are staggering. Exodus chapter 12 verse 37 mentions about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children, a figure which the book of Numbers later refines to a precise 603,550 men of military age. This would imply a total population of somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million people moving as a single body through the arid Sinai Peninsula. A migration of this magnitude would be an unprecedented event in ancient history, far surpassing any other known population movement of the era. The logistical challenges of providing food, water, and sanitation for millions of people and their livestock in one of the world's most inhospitable environments are almost impossible to comprehend. Such a massive group would have left behind an enormous archaeological footprint, campsites, pottery shards, graves, and other detritus of daily life. Yet despite decades of intensive archaeological surveys in the Sinai, no concrete evidence for such a mass migration during the proposed timeframes of the Late Bronze Age has ever been discovered. This stark absence of physical proof is a significant hurdle for those who hold to a literal interpretation of the story. This lack of corroborating evidence, coupled with the complete silence on the matter in the otherwise meticulous records of the Egyptian Empire, has led many mainstream scholars and archaeologists to conclude that the Exodus, as described in the Bible, did not happen. It is highly improbable that the Egyptians would fail to record the sudden departure of their entire slave labor force or the catastrophic loss of their army. However, dismissing the entire narrative as pure fiction may be too simplistic. It is far more likely that the story is not a fabrication but a foundation myth, a sacred history that has been layered with theological meaning and epic embellishments over centuries of oral and written tradition, much like a fisherman's tale that grows with each telling. The core of a historical memory may very well exist beneath these layers of epic storytelling. The narrative's power lies not necessarily in its numerical accuracy, but in its theological and cultural truth for the people who preserved it. It's possible that the original event was much smaller in scale, perhaps involving a few thousand or even a few hundred individuals escaping Egyptian control. This smaller group's story of liberation could have been magnified and universalized over time to encompass the entire nation of Israel, becoming the defining story of their collective identity and their special relationship with their God, Yahweh. The question then shifts from, did it happen exactly as written, to what historical event could have inspired such a powerful and enduring story? If the biblical Exodus is not a literal history of 2 million people, but rather an embellished memory of a real event, then we must search for a historical parallel that fits the general contours of the story. We need a moment in recorded Egyptian history that involves a large group of Semitic-speaking people residing in the eastern Nile Delta, who eventually leave Egypt under duress and migrate back towards the Levant, the region that includes Canaan. Remarkably, such an event is not only known but well documented in Egyptian records. This event is the rise and subsequent expulsion of a group known to history as the Hyksos, a name meaning rulers of foreign lands. The Hyksos were a people of West Asian or Semitic origin who began migrating into the Nile Delta around the 18th century BCE. They brought with them new technologies like the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. Over time, their influence grew until they established their own dynasty, ruling over Lower and Middle Egypt for over a century from their capital city of Avaris. This city of Avaris is located at the same site as the biblical city of Ramses, the very place the Israelites were said to have built as slaves. The period of Hyksos rule aligns intriguingly with the biblical story of Joseph, a Semite who rises to a position of great power in Egypt, facilitating his family's settlement in the Delta. The rule of these foreign Semitic kings eventually came to a violent end. A native Egyptian dynasty from Thebes in the south launched a war of liberation. Around 1570 BCE, the pharaoh Amosi I successfully conquered Avaris and drove the Hyksos and their followers out of Egypt. Egyptian records, such as the writings of the historian Manetho, describe a mass departure of these Semitic peoples who were forced to flee across the Sinai desert and back into the Levant. This historical expulsion of a large Semitic population from the Delta region provides a compelling and historically attested framework for the origin of the Exodus tradition. It is a story of a group of Asiatics who were once powerful in Egypt and were later forced to leave. Here the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. We have a historical event that mirrors the biblical narrative in its most essential elements: a Semitic people in Egypt, their eventual departure, and their journey back toward Canaan. The memory of this traumatic but ultimately successful migration could have been preserved for generations, passed down through oral tradition. Over time, the story would have been transformed, the historical details reshaped to fit a new theological understanding. The Hyksos rulers who were expelled could have been reimagined as the Israelite slaves who were liberated. In this light, the Exodus is not a fiction, but a profound reinterpretation of a real historical trauma, transforming a military defeat into a story of divine salvation and the birth of a nation. But if the Exodus tradition is rooted in historical memory, what are we to make of its most dramatic moment, the miraculous crossing of the sea? For centuries, the story has been told of the Israelites trapped between Pharaoh's army and the impassable waters, only to witness the sea part before them, granting a path to freedom while swallowing their pursuers. Yet, even the name of this body of water is subject to debate. The Hebrew text refers not to the Red Sea, but to Yam Suf, translated as the Sea of Reeds. The precise location of this crossing remains one of the great mysteries of biblical archaeology. Was it the vast deep waters of the Red Sea as we know it today, or a marshy lake or lagoon in the Nile Delta, choked with reeds and shallows? Some scholars point to lakes such as Lake Timsah or the Bitter Lakes, suggesting that these reed-filled waters better fit the ancient description. These wetlands could have posed a formidable barrier to a fleeing population, especially during the seasonal flooding of the Nile. Modern science offers yet another perspective. In recent years, researchers have explored the phenomenon of wind set-down, a rare but observable event where a strong, sustained wind blowing over shallow waters can push the surface aside, exposing the seabed for a brief window of time. Computer simulations have demonstrated that a powerful easterly wind lasting through the night could indeed drive back the waters of a shallow lake or lagoon, creating a temporary land bridge wide enough for a group to cross. As the wind dies down, the waters surge back, trapping anyone left behind. This natural explanation does not diminish the awe of the moment, but rather reframes it as a convergence of timing, weather, and geography, an extraordinary event remembered and retold as a miracle of deliverance. In the end, the crossing of the sea stands as both a powerful symbol and a historical enigma, inviting us to look deeper into the landscape of memory where history and legend intermingle. The search for the true path of the Exodus continues as scholars, scientists, and seekers follow the traces left by a people in search of freedom. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you would truly like to support the author Joshua or wish to learn more about humanity's hidden history, you can purchase your copy of Forbidden Genesis, the untold story of man today. The link is in the description box below. Thank you so much for your time.